Well, the first thing to remember, I think, is we just took delivery here a couple of weeks ago the George H.W. Bush, which is the last Nimitz-class carrier that we're going to build. And so it, it looks about like this ship. It's obviously different in a lot of ways, but generally speaking, you put Nimitz and the H.W. Bush side by side, go away 5 miles, and you couldn't tell which one's which. The last commanding officer of the Bush hasn't been born yet, because that's a ship that we intend to have in service for 50 years. You're not quite 50 years old in their carriers yet. And so, sometime this year or next, the final person that's going to command that ship is going to be born. So the first thing you have to build into your carriers, because we keep them around for so long, because there's such a tremendous investment in building them in the first place, is enough flexibility to be able to adapt to changing technologies. And Nimitz is a great example of that. This is a ship that was designed in the 60s, and keel was laid in the late 60s. The ship was commissioned in the 70s. And it was commissioned at a time when we were just beginning to understand that not only could you, via satellite, move a sporting event in France, in the Alps, or someplace else, transport it all the way back electronically to the United States so we can all see it on the worldwide world of sports. So we were just really at a very nascent age in terms of satellite communications. There were no fiber optics, they didn't exist yet, there were no flat screen TVs. And so when you look at what's available here on Nimitz, and it's one of the things that makes Nimitz or other Nimitz class carriers special, it's not just the fact that we can launch airplanes, is that we can collect information and intelligence from around the world virtually 24/7. We're hooked up back with the intelligence organizations throughout the United States and with embassies throughout the world. And so when we go somewhere, when you turn on your television and you hear that the President has sent the USS Nimitz off to the Western Pacific, for example, it's not just an aircraft carrier and 50 or 60 strike fighters. It's an aircraft carrier and all of the capability to gather intelligence, to understand the environment around it, to make plans, either to stabilize a particular region of the world, or to show resolve and an ability to project power should that be necessary. And then we're staffed to collect that information, and then we're staffed to process it and develop plans. And so on the ship, and it's hard to get this as you do a tour, because first of all, the big show's up on the flight deck, and so that draws everybody's attention. But our staff has about 70 people on it. A lot of them relatively senior, 05s who have already had command of another ship or a squadron. We have a large intelligence apparatus throughout the ship. My staff has a pretty good intelligence shop. The destroyer squadron staff, which is commanded by a captain, has an intelligence shop. The ship has their own intelligence center. I think, in fact, you might have gotten a chance to go there. If not, I think you will. So we have all of this capability that allows us not just to bring a big ship that can project power, but to bring a big ship that can project power that has the capability to plan on what that power projection ought to look like, or whether or not we really think that that's the right course of action to recommend up the chain of command. But a lot of the tools that we used to do that were not invented when the ship was designed and the keel was laid. And so we need a flexible platform. What will the flight deck look like on the George H.W. Bush 50 years from now when it's on its last deployment instead of getting ready before its first? I think there'll be a different way to launch airplanes, and what I don't know is whether that's an electromagnetic catapult or it's improvements in engine technology that allow us to use to have short takeoff and landing aircraft that don't require a catapult to get airborne without the big payload decrease that we have today. If you look at the Joint Strike Fighter, which promises to be a very capable airframe, the various different types of airplanes, the variants that are available, include a short takeoff and landing version that the Marine Corps very much wants to replace their Harrier fleet. But it comes at a pretty good size cost, both in terms of how much fuel the airplane can carry and how much armament it can carry. And so, will technology allow us to do that without the big trade-offs that we have to make today? Certainly that might be the case. We make ships like Nimitz steamships, even though they're nuclear powered, because we need the steam for the catapults. If we don't need the steam for the catapults, do we need a nuclear power plant? Do we need a steam plant to drive the ship, or are there other ways to propel the ship? And those are technologies that we're exploring now. In fact, we're at a very interesting time. And if you look at the history of carrier development, actually Nimitz turns out, I think, to be the one program that has had the greatest longevity in terms of a particular type of carrier, a class of carrier. But if you look at what we built in between the Forrestal class, which included ships like Forrestal and Independence and Ranger, and then we built a couple of two slightly bigger ships, Constellation and Kitty Hawk. Then we built a nuclear carrier, the Enterprise, which is still in service. But it's we have 2 reactors on this ship. Enterprise has 8. So it's just like a conventional carrier that had 8 boilers, except we said, well, we need 8 reactors. So now they don't know what to do with it. Because it's got a lot of reactors, so it's really complicated. And then we built America and Kennedy, which were transition carriers between Constellation and Kitty Hawk and the Nimitz class. And we're at that same point again where we're going to build a couple of transition carriers that have some of these new technologies. In fact, for a while it looked like Bush was going to have some of these technologies, and the technology just didn't come along quickly enough to make people comfortable. And so, it has 4 catapults that are steam powered. It has 3 arresting wires like Reagan does instead of 4. But by and large, it functions the same way. The other thing to consider is, is the F-35, the Joint Strike Fighter, the last manned aircraft we're going to build, and it may very well be the case. Now, if you say that around here too loudly, you'll get a gang of pilots that, it's inconceivable that you could do that. And they'll ask, immediately ask the question, well, what do you do with all the pilots? Well, we did the same thing we did with all the sailmakers back in the early 1800s when we finally went to something besides sail power to propel our ships. But it's entirely likely that the unmanned aircraft become the wave of the future. And then the question becomes, do I need a catapult to launch them? An unmanned aircraft is a lot lighter and a lot simpler because you don't have to have any of the, you don't have to create an environment that a human can exist in. So it becomes a little bit like the discussion that we've had for the last 50 or 60 years about manned versus unmanned space exploration. What's better, what's cheaper, what's going to get us the most knowledge for the least amount of money. And so there's a lot to consider. And what I find encouraging about it is the debate rages, and it's there's a debate within the Navy over what aircraft carriers look like in the future and how big they need to be, how complex they need to be. And that's a debate that's been going on as long as we've had aircraft carriers. And then there's a debate within the services as to what is the right mix. If you're an Air Force pilot, how many aircraft carriers do you think the nation needs? It's a number closely approaching 0. If you're a Navy pilot, how many B-52s, B-2s, B-1s do we need? Same answer. We don't need those because we have aircraft carriers. Well, it turns out that mix of capability is something that really forms the basis for debate within the Department of Defense and then across the river over to the Congress in terms of what's the best mix that will serve the country in the most number of possible scenarios. And so you have to have some understanding what those scenarios might be. Very few people would have been willing to predict on September 10th, 2001 that the threat comes out of a cave in Afghanistan. But that was in fact the threat. And did we have a military that was capable of dealing with that threat? Well, as it turns out we did. So the same military that we built to deter and eventually defeat the Soviet Union was a military that served us very well in Afghanistan in the early days and served us very well during major combat operations in Iraq. Turns out it didn't serve us all that well when you're now effectively an occupying power with a rather robust insurgency. So the vehicles that our soldiers drive around in, which seem just fine if you're fighting the fight to pull the gap, didn't work all that well on the streets of Baghdad. And so it's a constant period of adjusting and readjusting and trying to understand what the right mix is. I don't know if that answers your question or not.